briefly welcome and introduce Johanna. As I said, it's really great that you are here because Johanna is one of the world's leading social psychologists on issues of collective victimhood, collective victim beliefs, and the role such beliefs have in intergroup relations, in relations between groups, also between minority groups. When we thought about who to invite for this peace psychology event, Johanna was our #1 priority on the list, so we are especially glad that she accepted to speak to us. She studied in Germany, in Cologne, where she finished her psychology degree in 2004. And then the first contact with the German Peace Psychology Association was 1 year later, when she had moved to the US for her PhD in the Psychology of Peace and Violence program at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. But she came back a year later to attend the annual Peace Psychology Conference in Germany when we first got into contact. Her dissertation was awarded the Gerd Sommer Award as well in 2009, which was also the year when she had completed her dissertation. After this, Johanna moved a few, not 100 kilometers, a few dozens of kilometers away from Amherst to Clark University, where now she is an associate professor. She will introduce her research much better herself, of course. We personally have at times collaborated a bit, but I leave it all to you to introduce your research, because you, of course, are the expert on collective victimhood, who we all look forward to listening to. So welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and as you mentioned, actually this conference was my first academic conference, I think, that I ever attended as a doctoral student. So the German Peace Psychology Association has a special place in my academic heart. And it's also nice to see my former German mentors here attending. Brigitte Scheele and Norbert Gröben are in the audience, and I worked with them when I was at Uni Köln. So as you can tell, I spent some time in Germany, 16 years, but I haven't spoken professional German for 17 years now. I only speak German with my 5-year-old daughter, so I'll stick to English for the talk. Aber wenn es Fragen auf Deutsch gibt, kann ich sie auch später auf Deutsch beantworten, kein Problem. So I'll start sharing my screen, and please feel free to interrupt if there are any issues along the way. All right, so the topic of my talk is how do people make sense of collective violence and oppression against their group, considering context and complexity in collective victim beliefs. And what this talk will mostly be about is looking at the assumptions and kind of the preoccupations in the emerging, relatively new research on collective victimhood in social psychology. So what I'll first do is go through some of these assumptions that we see in the literature so far. The first assumption that we see is rooted in the fact that a lot of this literature has started with an interest in conflict and its resolution. And because of this focus, the literature has really mostly been focusing on the consequences of collective victim beliefs on intergroup relations, while mostly ignoring any kind of intra-group dynamics that obviously are also relevant. Somewhat related to this, also again because of where this literature started, we see that the literature tends to assume destructive consequences of collective victim beliefs, collective memories of in-group victimization on intergroup violence. So there is an assumption that when people think about and remember their group's victimization, whether historical or ongoing, that it will contribute to cycles of violence. So overall, there is sort of a pathologizing view of how people understand, make sense of, and cope with oppression, which we also see in other domains in the field, for example, the coping literature. Two examples of this are, there are several studies showing that when you remind people experimentally of their group's historical victimization, it increases legitimization of violence and unrelated conflicts. And there's also an assumption that competitive victimhood is kind of the default that people have when they think about their group's victimization. So the idea is that groups will try to claim victimhood and to win the victim status. And many of the studies that we have in the field focus on this phenomenon of competitive victimhood, while kind of ignoring a lot of other ways in which people may make sense of their group's victimization. What this implies, this desire or assumed, presumed desire that victim groups want to win the victim status, this also assumes that the in-group's victimization is central to group members, meaning that they think it is important and relevant to their group's identity, that it is something that they are perhaps even preoccupied with or care about a lot. Finally, another kind of different assumption in this literature comes from mostly the needs-based model of reconciliation, which assumes that victim groups perceive their group to lack power and to be centrally motivated by a desire for empowerment, mostly through perpetrator groups' actions. So again, the assumption here is that victim groups will perceive themselves as vulnerable, weak, and powerless. And then finally, like most of the literature in psychology, we also tend to focus on just a limited number of individual constructs related to collective victim beliefs, rather than looking at clusters or networks of beliefs. And again, this tendency to focus on just one or two constructs at the time, and also kind of to jump onto the bandwagon of what has already been established, such as competitive victimhood, these tendencies may have contributed to what is now a very narrow focus in the field on just very few limited ways of construing collective victimization. So most of this literature has focused on comparative victim beliefs, competitive victimhood, and inclusive victim beliefs, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there are some other individual constructs that have also generated a few studies, such as PIVO, perpetual in-group victimhood orientation, or siege mentality. But overall, there's not a lot, and there's a tendency to focus on just these few constructs as opposed to looking at the complexity of collective victim beliefs. So in this talk, by the way, sorry, is this box, do you see like a gray box that is disturbing your view of the slides or not? Okay, good, because I'm moving it around because I thought it's blocking something. Anyway, in this talk, I will present some counterpoints to these assumptions in the field and these kind of preoccupations of the field. And I will do this by presenting data from studies in a few different contexts using different methodologies. So in contrast to the assumptions in the field, I will argue with these studies that construals of collective victimization are much more complex and multifaceted. That's kind of the key take-home message. I will show and argue that comparative victim beliefs and also in general intergroup relations are not always victim groups' primary concern. Similarly, outcomes of collective victim beliefs of people contemplating their group's victimization are not inevitably destructive. Instead, it depends on how collective victimization is construed. Also, sorry, I have to move this so that I can see. Contrary to what we see in the field, collective victim beliefs go beyond a focus on harm and vulnerability, and they also focus on power, resistance, and resilience. And finally, not all group members actually perceive their group's victimization to be relevant and central to the group or to their individual goals. So the studies that I will show you, as I said, use multiple methodologies and draw on data from several different contexts listed here. So overall, in these studies, we have both national majority groups with kind of more historical memories of collective victimization, as well as ethnic minority groups, experiencing ongoing oppression and violence. We have groups with varying degrees of group-based power, and also different cultural contexts.